Welcome to the channel. The World Cup will soon be upon us, and if you ask an average football fan about the first World Cup in 1930, they'll likely tell you two things with confidence. It was hosted by Uruguay, and Uruguay won it. Some will even recall that Argentina were the beaten finalists. But press them on who scored the very first goal in the history of the FIFA World Cup, and you'll almost certainly be met with silence. Perhaps even a confident wrong answer. The answer is Lucien Laurent of France, and his anonymity in popular football culture is almost as remarkable as the goal itself. The first ever FIFA World Cup goal was scored by Lucien Laurent, playing for France against Mexico at the 1930 World Cup in Estadio Pocitos, Montevideo, Uruguay, on the 13th of July 1930. The goal, a 19th-minute volley, was the opener in France's 4-1 victory over Mexico. We get a glimpse of it in Laurent's own words. "We were playing Mexico, and it was snowing, since it was winter in the southern hemisphere. One of my teammates centered the ball, and I followed its path carefully, taking it on the volley with my right foot." Simple. Understated. Eternal. What makes Laurent's story even more poignant is how little he sought the spotlight afterward. Modest to a fault, Laurent barely spoke about his legendary contribution to the game in the years that followed. Capped 10 times by his country, he ended his career as player-coach at Besançon before buying a bar, where he very rarely discussed his 19th-minute volley against the Mexicans. "Liberati put the cross in," was all he would say if the topic came up, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The man literally deflected credit to the man who assisted for the goal. It was not a day that felt like the beginning of anything. The sky above Pocitos, Montevideo hung gray and sullen, and a freak July snowfall dusted the pitch at Estadio Parque Central in a way that nobody who played that afternoon would ever quite forget. The players of France and Mexico, two nations whose football lineages were, at that moment, almost entirely unwritten, stamped their boots in the mud and breathed white clouds into the cold South American air. It was in the 19th minute a cross came in from the left flank. Lucien Laurent, compact and quick, met it on the volley. The ball flew into the net. His teammates patted him on the back. France led, and the match moved on. No flashy celebrations. The journalists at the ground did not rush to their typewriters to declare the birth of football's most consequential statistic. Laurent himself barely paused. He had scored a goal. He would try to score another. We didn't realize the significance at the time. We just played. It was only much later that people began to make a fuss. Only much later would the world understand that the volley in the Uruguayan cold was the first goal ever scored at a FIFA World Cup. The opening note of a tournament that would, across the century to come, would become the most watched sporting event on earth. Memories of his goal first came flooding back at a gala dinner held by the organizers of the 1990 FIFA World Cup in Italy. By the time France 1998 came around, the former Sochaux player was virtually a national treasure, speaking at length as he dug deep into his memories and recalled tales that are part of World Cup folklore, such as the team's voyage to Uruguay on the Italian liner Conte Verde, which set sail from Villefranche-sur-Mer on the 19th of June 1930. 15 days to get there and 15 days to come back, Laurent recalled. It took 60 years for the world to properly sit down and hear his story. France opened the scoring after 19 minutes, Lucien Laurent converting a cross from Ernest Liberati, and the iconic Estadio Centenario wasn't even ready in time to host the match. The most historic goal in football history was scored in a secondary stadium, in front of a modest crowd. Despite France's early victory, they lost their following matches in Group 1 to Argentina and Chile, finishing third and therefore being eliminated in the group stage. Laurent was ruled out of the third game due to an ankle injury sustained from a tackle during the match against Argentina. So the man who opened the entire World Cup chapter didn't even make it through the group stage, which perhaps explains why his name faded so quickly from the global consciousness. The narrative that dominates is Uruguay's, And understandably so. In the final, hosts and pre-tournament favorites Uruguay defeated Argentina 4-2 in front of 68,346 people to become the first nation to win the World Cup. That is the story of glory, of triumph on home soil, of a nation so euphoric that the following day was declared a national holiday in Uruguay, while in Buenos Aires a mob threw stones at the Uruguayan consulate. A quiet Frenchman volleying home a goal on a snowy afternoon against Mexico does not carry the same cinematic weight, even if it literally started everything. There's an almost philosophical tragedy here. The World Cup exists because of goals. Every 4 years, billions of people tune in for goals. And yet, the single most historically significant goal ever scored, the one that opened a century of football's greatest tournament, belongs to a man who went home and bought a bar and said almost nothing about it for decades. FIFA.com, marking the 90th anniversary of the goal, noted, "Firsts are never forgotten." But in Laurent's case, that was precisely what happened. The irony of that statement could not be sharper. Lucien Laurent deserves to be a name every football fan knows. Instead, he remains one of the sport's best-kept secrets. The man who kicked off history, then quietly went home. Lucien Laurent was born on the 10th of December 1907 in Saint-Maur-des-Fossés, a quiet town folded into a bend of the Marne River just east of Paris. It was not a glamorous beginning, and he would have been the first to say so. Football, in those pre-war years, was not the profession it would become. It was something young men did on their afternoons off, before they went back to the factory. And so Laurent did both. He played for local clubs with the kind of unsentimental dedication common to his generation, and he worked the assembly lines at the Peugeot factory, a detail that would shape not just his youth, but his entire footballing career. In France's amateur era, players were not paid to play. They were paid to work. Football was the luxury that filled the hours that industry left over. Laurent's footballing life took him from the amateur pitches of the Paris suburbs to CA Paris, and eventually to FC Sochaux Montbéliard, a club founded by and intimately connected to Peugeot itself. The symmetry was apparent. Sochaux gave Laurent a home at a moment when French football was beginning, tentatively, to professionalize. When France were invited to compete at the inaugural World Cup in Uruguay in 1930, a tournament conceived by FIFA president Jules Rimet and hosted by the only nation willing to bear its considerable cost, Laurent was chosen as part of the traveling party. The journey alone was an ordeal, a 3-week voyage across the Atlantic by steamship, crowded and long, with no guarantee of a welcome and no clear sense of what exactly they were sailing towards. Only 13 nations competed. The stands at Parquet Central held fewer than 10,000 spectators for some matches. The World Cup in 1930 was still an idea in search of itself. Lucien Laurent helped give it its first indelible fact. A decade after Uruguay, the world Laurent had known collapsed. When Germany invaded France in 1940, Laurent, like hundreds of thousands of his compatriots, was taken prisoner. He spent the better part of 5 years in a German prisoner of war camp. He returned after the war. He did not speak much about it afterward. Men of his generation rarely did. The war was something that had happened, like weather, and the task of the living was to continue living. He picked up what remained of his ordinary existence: family, the rhythms of peacetime, the memory of football, and carried them forward. It is worth pausing on this. The man who scored the first World Cup goal also survived 5 years of captivity at the hands of an occupying army. He had sailed to Uruguay to write the first line of football history, and then returned home to live through one of the darkest chapters in human history. Both things were true of him at once. After the war, Laurent settled into the kind of life that does not attract biography, which is to say, the kind of life that most of us actually live. He had a family. He had his health, mostly. He had his memories. Recognition came late, and it came gently. As the World Cup grew into the planetary spectacle it became, Journalists and historians began to search backward, looking for origins. They found Laurent. He received them with the unaffected courtesy of a man who had never quite understood what all the fuss was about. He would describe the goal, the cross, the volley, the cold, in plain specific language, and then he would seem mildly puzzled that anyone should want to hear it again. Of the French players who sailed to Uruguay in 1930, only one was still alive in the summer of 1998. Lucien Laurent, then 90 years old, sat and watched his country lift the trophy that Jules Rimet, the same man who had organized that first tournament 68 years before, had dreamed of creating. What passed through his mind in those moments we cannot fully know. He had scored the first goal in the history of that trophy. He had lived to see his nation win it. He was the last thread connecting 1930 to 1998, the only living bridge between the tournament's first breath and its greatest triumph for France. When asked about it, he smiled the smile of a man who had seen more than most and made peace with all of it. He was, by then, very old. He had earned that smile. Lucien Laurent died on the 11th of April 2005 in Besançon, France. He was 97 years old. The obituaries, when they came, were warm and precise. They noted the goal, the date, the minute, the weather. They noted that he had been a modest man who bore an immodest distinction with uncommon grace. He was buried without the fanfare that, perhaps, such a life deserved. But he would not have wanted fanfare. He was a man who had crossed an ocean to play football, scored a goal that no one recognized as historic, returned home, survived a war, raised a family, watched his country win the World Cup, and then quietly closed his eyes. That is how it always begins. A moment that does not yet know it is a moment. A man who does not yet know he is history. The World Cup has seen thousands of goals since 1930, but there will only ever be one first, and it belongs to Lucien. Subscribe now for more interesting and educating stories.